Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the pills that Hollywood called vitamins and coroners called evidence. Barbiturates killed more Golden Age stars than car crashes, plane disasters, and jealous lovers combined, yet doctors handed them out like breath mints at a garlic festival. The same drug that promised 8 hours of perfect sleep delivered eternal rest to Marilyn Monroe, Judy Garland, and dozens of others whose names once lit up movie marquees. Here's the twisted joke. Barbiturates were supposed to be the safe alternative to the dangerous sleeping drugs of the early 1900s. They solved insomnia but created an addiction so profound that withdrawal could trigger seizures violent enough to break bones. Medical science spent 50 years perfecting the art of killing people slowly with prescription pads. Dear viewers, our big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and with your support we can achieve it. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about drugs. Subscribe so you don't miss them. We are sincerely grateful to everyone who helps us achieve this goal. Also, write in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious to see people from all over the world brought together by a single story. And now, let's move on to today's story. To understand how barbiturates conquered Hollywood, you first need to understand that their origin story reads like accidental genius mixed with romantic speculation. Adolf von Baer synthesized barbituric acid on December 4, 1864, in his laboratory in Ghent, Belgium. The German chemist combined urea from animal urine with malonic acid derived from apples, creating a compound nobody knew what to do with for nearly 40 years. Some historians claim he named it after his girlfriend Barbara. Others insist he celebrated the achievement on St. Barbara's Day and honoured the patron saint of artillerymen and sudden death. The irony of naming a future killer after the protector against sudden death apparently escaped everyone. Baer won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1905, but not for barbituric acid. That remained a laboratory curiosity until 2 other German scientists realized what they had. Joseph von Mehring and Emil Fischer took Bayer's compound and modified it, creating diethyl barbituric acid in 1903. They called it Veronal, naming it after the Italian city of Verona, because Fischer had supposedly conceived the idea while vacationing there. The German pharmaceutical giant Bayer began manufacturing it immediately, marketing it as the first safe and effective sleeping pill. Safe. That word sold millions. Veronal worked by targeting gamma-aminobutyric acid receptors in the brain, though nobody understood the mechanism in 1903. Imagine your brain as a house with every light blazing, every television shouting, every radio playing different stations simultaneously. Barbiturates walk through that house and flip every switch to off. The neurotransmitter GABA normally tells your brain to calm down, reducing electrical activity in neurons like a dimmer switch lowering gradually. Barbiturates don't dim anything. They cut the power completely. Every anxious thought, every racing worry, every physical tension collapses into chemical silence. Patients loved it. Doctors worshipped it. The medical community had struggled for centuries with sleep disorders and anxiety. Opium worked but created obvious addicts. Alcohol functioned as medicine but smelled like vice. Chloral hydrate knocked people unconscious but tasted horrible in damaged stomachs. Barbiturates arrived odorless, tasteless, and apparently miracle-working. Physicians prescribed Veronal for insomnia, nervousness, epilepsy, and 100 other conditions where making the brain shut up seemed therapeutic. Bayer wasn't alone for long. Pharmaceutical companies across Europe and America recognized the fortune hiding in a good night's sleep. Phenobarbital appeared in 1912 under the brand name Luminal, marketed primarily for epilepsy but quickly prescribed for everything else. Amobarbital arrived in 1923 as Amital, the famous truth serum that supposedly made people confess secrets under its influence. Pentobarbital emerged in 1930 as Nembutal, becoming the gold standard for surgical anesthesia and later the preferred method for both euthanizing animals and executing prisoners. By 1935, medical journals documented over 2,500 different barbiturate variants. The drugs differed mainly in how quickly they worked and how long they lasted. Some acted within minutes but wore off in hours, useful for inducing sleep but requiring middle-of-the-night redosing. Others took longer to kick in but provided sedation for 8 to 12 hours straight. Secobarbital, marketed as Seconal, became known as the Red Devil for its scarlet capsules and reputation for aggressive sedation. Pentobarbital earned the nickname Yellow Jackets from its sunshine-coloured pills that could drop a grown man into unconsciousness within 20 minutes. The American Medical Association endorsed barbiturates enthusiastically. Medical textbooks praised them as non-addictive, which should have won an award for history's most catastrophically wrong professional consensus. Pharmacies stocked them in bulk. Doctors prescribed them for complaints ranging from genuine insomnia to simple complaints of feeling nervous. Got a headache? Barbiturates. Anxious about a job interview? Barbiturates. Trouble sleeping because your neighbour's dog barks? Barbiturates. Plus maybe some for the dog. Then Hollywood discovered them, and the party really started. The film industry of the 1930s ran on impossible schedules and inhuman expectations. Studios owned actors through 7-year contracts that made medieval serfdom look like a sweet deal. Stars worked 18-hour days shooting one film, then reported to another set for night scenes on a different production. Sleep became a luxury nobody could afford, yet exhaustion showed on camera in a business that worshipped flawless faces. The studio system needed workers who could perform on command, sleep on command, and wake on command without looking like death warmed over. Barbiturates solved that problem perfectly. MGM kept doctors on payroll specifically to manage their stable of stars. These weren't healers concerned with long-term patient welfare. They were pharmaceutical mechanics maintaining expensive machinery. An actor finished shooting at midnight, wired from adrenaline and Klieg lights. Doctor hands them Seconal. They need to be camera-ready at 5 in the morning. Doctor provides Benzedrine or Dexedrine to counteract the barbiturate hangover. Can't sleep after the amphetamines. More barbiturates. The cycle spun faster and faster, with physicians writing prescriptions like they were handing out aspirin. Studios called them vitamins. That wasn't ignorance, it was branding. If pills were vitamins, then taking them meant health maintenance rather than drug dependency. The terminology provided plausible deniability when stars showed up to set slurring their words or forgot their lines mid-scene. She's not drugged, she's just vitamin deficient. The publicists could spin anything except dead bodies, and even those they managed for a while. Clark Gable took them. Joan Crawford swore by them. Errol Flynn mixed them with everything. But nobody embodied the barbiturate age quite like the young women the studios manufactured into symbols of American beauty and innocence. These actresses faced particular pressure to remain thin, energetic, camera perfect, and sexually available to male executives while publicly virginal. The contradiction required chemical management. Judy Garland received her first barbiturates at 15 years old from MGM's medical staff. They'd already been feeding her amphetamines to suppress her appetite and maintain the energy to shoot The Wizard of Oz on a brutal schedule. Studio head Louis B. Mayer reportedly told the doctor handling Garland to keep her going, keep her happy, keep her thin. The barbiturates counteracted the amphetamines just enough to let her sleep 3 or 4 hours before the cycle restarted. This wasn't medicine. It was controlled demolition of a human nervous system spread out over decades. The drugs were legal, the prescriptions were legitimate, the doctors had medical degrees and everything. None of that made it less monstrous, just more bureaucratically tidy. Pharmacological reality didn't care about legality. Barbiturates created physical dependency within weeks of regular use. The brain adapted to constant GABA receptor overstimulation by becoming less sensitive to the drug's effects. Users needed higher doses to achieve the same sleep, then higher still, then doses that crept toward the lethal threshold. The difference between a therapeutic dose and a fatal dose was shockingly small. Sometimes just 2 or 3 extra pills separated sleep from coma. Withdrawal brought hell. Stopping barbiturates suddenly triggered seizures, hallucinations, and delirium that made heroin withdrawal look mild by comparison. Chronic users who tried to quit experienced tremors so violent they couldn't hold a glass of water. Some hallucinated insects crawling under their skin. Others seized so badly they cracked vertebrae or bit through their own tongues. Deaths from barbiturate withdrawal were common enough that medical literature developed specific protocols for tapering patients off slowly over months, though most doctors simply kept writing prescriptions rather than face the nightmare of detoxification. Hollywood didn't care about any of this. The studios had investments to protect. A major star represented millions of dollars in production costs, publicity campaigns, and future earnings. If keeping that investment functional required pills, then pills it was. The stars themselves rarely understood what was happening to their brains and bodies. Doctors assured them the medications were perfectly safe when taken as directed, neglecting to mention that tolerance made as directed a moving target that eventually moved right off a cliff. By 1940, barbiturate prescriptions in the United States exceeded 500 million pills annually. A decade later, that number doubled. The pharmaceutical companies printed money while medical journals began publishing the first concerned papers about addiction and overdose deaths. Those concerns moved at the speed of academic peer review and institutional caution, which meant roughly the pace of continental drift. Meanwhile, America swallowed billions of pills, and Hollywood's brightest lights began burning out in bedrooms, hotel rooms, and private residences with empty bottles on the nightstand. The drugs worked exactly as advertised. They induced sleep, suppressed anxiety, and provided relief from the grinding pressure of fame and overwork. They also accumulated in fatty tissues, built up in the liver, and created a chemical dependency that rewired brain chemistry permanently. Users didn't feel high, they felt normal, which was the insidious part. Normal required pills. Facing the day required pills. Sleeping required pills. Eventually, simply existing required maintaining a specific blood concentration of barbiturates, or risk the screaming withdrawal that lurked just hours away from the last dose. The golden age of Hollywood glittered magnificently on screen while backstage, studio doctors distributed enough barbiturates to tranquilize a medium-sized city. Everyone knew. The actors knew. The directors knew. The executives definitely knew. Nobody talked about it publicly because the system functioned smoothly, as long as everyone maintained the polite fiction that these were simply medications for nervous conditions and difficulty sleeping. The truth, that Hollywood ran on industrial-scale drug dependency, managed by complicit physicians, remained an open secret protected by publicity machines and mutually assured scandal. The miracle sleep came with a price tag, and Hollywood was about to start paying it in bodies. The studio system didn't just employ actors, it owned them like racehorses or oil rigs. 7-year contracts signed by desperate young hopefuls gave studios total control over every aspect of their lives. MGM could dictate what an actress ate for breakfast, who she dated publicly, whether she could get married, and if pregnancy was permitted that year. Warner Brothers decided if an actor attended college, took vacations, or visited dying relatives. Paramount determined haircuts, nose jobs, and whether original teeth were acceptable or required replacement with expensive veneers. Stars worked simultaneously on multiple films, shuttling between sets like assembly line components. Joan Crawford finished shooting Mildred Pierce at Warner Brothers in the afternoon, then drove to MGM for evening wardrobe fittings on her next project. Judy Garland completed musical numbers for Meet Me in St. Louis during the day, while recording songs for a different film at night. The human body required sleep, but production schedules didn't account for biological limitations. Studios had invested millions in these performers and intended to extract maximum return before their contracts expired or their looks faded. Executives calculated star value with ruthless precision. A major actress generated roughly $2 million per picture in 1940s money, adjusted for her draw at the box office. Multiply that by 4 or 5 films per year under contract, and a single performer represented $10 million in annual revenue. Losing production days to illness, exhaustion, or nervous breakdown cost the studio money and pushed back release schedules for films already sold to theatres. The solution was obvious: keep the talent functional by any means necessary. Enter the studio doctors, whose Hippocratic oath apparently had a clause about serving corporate interests first. These physicians understood their actual job description: maintain the product, not the patient. MGM's medical staff answered directly to executives, not to medical boards or ethical standards. When Louis B. Mayer wanted Judy Garland thinner for The Wizard of Oz, the doctors provided amphetamines. When those amphetamines made her too wired to sleep, they prescribed barbiturates. When she developed tolerance to both, they increased dosages rather than question the fundamental insanity of drugging a 15-year-old into compliance. The vitamin routine became standard practice across all major studios by 1940. Mornings started with Benzedrine or Dexedrine, amphetamines that suppressed appetite and provided artificial energy for 12 to 16-hour workdays. Lunch breaks featured more stimulants if the afternoon shoot demanded dancing, action scenes, or multiple takes of physically demanding sequences. Evenings brought the barbiturates, Seconal, Nembutal, or Emmetal, depending on which doctor was writing prescriptions, and which pharmaceutical company was currently courting the studio. Seconal earned its Red Devil nickname honestly. The scarlet capsules hit hard and fast, dropping users into unconsciousness within 20 to 30 minutes. Studios preferred it for actors who needed to sleep immediately after finishing late shoots, though the drug's intensity created morning grogginess that required additional stimulants to counteract. Nembutal's yellow capsules worked slightly slower but lasted longer, making them ideal for actors with early morning call times who needed 6 solid hours without waking. Amytal, the blue pills, fell somewhere between the other two in speed and duration. Street dealers would have been impressed by the pharmaceutical sophistication. Studio doctors mixed and matched barbiturates based on shooting schedules, creating customized drug regimens for each star. Clark Gable got different pills than Katharine Hepburn because his scenes required different energy levels and his metabolism processed the drugs differently. Spencer Tracy required special handling because he mixed everything with alcohol, necessitating lower barbiturate doses to prevent accidental overdose. The doctors kept detailed records of who received what, when, and in what combinations, not for medical purposes, but to maintain plausible deniability if anyone died. Nobody called it drug dealing because prescription pads made it legitimate. The same pills sold on street corners led to arrests, but obtained through studio physicians, they were simply medical treatment for the rigors of stardom. This distinction mattered legally while meaning nothing pharmacologically. A barbiturate purchased illegally and one prescribed by a doctor on MGM's payroll produced identical effects: sedation, respiratory depression, physical dependency, and eventually tolerance requiring escalating doses. Tolerance was the silent killer nobody discussed. First-time users took 1 Seconal capsule and slept beautifully. A month later, One capsule barely made them drowsy. 3 months in, they needed 2 capsules, then 3, then 4. The therapeutic window narrowed with each dose increase. Medical literature established that 5 grains of barbiturates induce sleep safely in non-tolerant patients, while 10 grains could prove fatal. Chronic users routinely took 15 to 20 grains just to feel normal, skating on the edge of lethality every single night. Studios didn't monitor this progression because monitoring would have required acknowledging the problem. Easier to let the doctors handle it and trust that expensive assets wouldn't accidentally kill themselves before their contracts expired. When stars showed up to set obviously impaired, slurring words or forgetting blocking, directors simply shot around them or called early wraps. Publicists explained away erratic behavior as exhaustion, stress, or artistic temperament. The machinery of Hollywood ran on lies that everyone agreed to pretend were truth. Judy Garland's descent illustrated the pattern perfectly. MGM signed her at 13, put her on amphetamines at 14, added barbiturates at 15. By 18, she was taking both daily in doses that would have hospitalized someone without tolerance. By 21, she required intervention from studio doctors just to get through normal days. The doses kept climbing because her liver processed the drugs more efficiently as it adapted, and because psychological dependency made missing doses unthinkable. She wasn't weak or lacking willpower. She was chemically dependent in ways that made quitting without medical supervision potentially fatal. The other studios watched MGM's methods and copied them enthusiastically. Warner Brothers established its own medical department focused on keeping stars productive. Paramount hired doctors who understood that their primary responsibility involved maintaining shooting schedules, not patient health. 20th Century Fox created a whole infrastructure around managing performer drug use, complete with on-set nurses who distributed pills between takes. We hope you have already subscribed to our channel, and if not, please do so right now. Our goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. This is very important to us. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about drugs. Subscribe so you don't miss them, and we'll get back to the story. The pharmaceutical companies loved Hollywood. Studios purchased barbiturates in bulk quantities that rivaled hospital networks, creating a lucrative and reliable revenue stream. Sales representatives visited studio lots regularly, providing free samples of new formulations and hosting educational sessions for the doctors. Abbott Laboratories, which manufactured Nembutal, reportedly gave preferential pricing to major studios in exchange for informal endorsements. When stars were photographed looking rested and beautiful, they were inadvertently advertising the drugs that made sleep possible despite impossible schedules. Prescriptions flowed without meaningful oversight. A single studio doctor might write 200 barbiturate prescriptions per month, an absurd number that should have triggered medical board investigations. Those investigations never materialized because the prescriptions were technically legitimate, and the patients technically needed sleep aids. Nobody checked whether the same patient received prescriptions from multiple doctors simultaneously, creating dangerous overlaps in medication. Nobody tracked total consumption per individual or flagged concerning usage patterns. The stars themselves rarely understood what was happening to their bodies. Most had limited education and came from working-class backgrounds where doctors were respected authority figures whose instructions you followed without question. If a physician in a white coat said these pills were necessary for health and career success, you believed him. The studio framed drug-taking as professional duty. These medications kept you employable, camera-ready, and valuable. Refusing them meant you weren't serious about your career, weren't willing to make sacrifices, weren't tough enough for Hollywood. This created a perverse incentive structure where drug dependency became a marker of professionalism. Stars who could work 18-hour days without complaint earned praise and better roles. Those who struggled were labelled difficult, uncooperative, or not star material. Nobody acknowledged that the successful ones succeeded because they'd surrendered their neurochemistry to studio physicians who kept them artificially functional. The mythology of the tireless performer obscured the reality of the thoroughly drugged one. Young actors arriving in Hollywood saw established stars taking pills and assumed this was normal industry practice. The normalization spread like a virus through the entertainment community. Barbiturates became as routine as makeup calls and costume fittings, just another aspect of the job. By 1950, an estimated 70% of major studio contract players used barbiturates regularly, most with prescriptions from studio-affiliated doctors. The pills reshaped social behavior in unexpected ways. Stars attended parties and premieres while heavily sedated, creating the languid, dreamy effect that became associated with Hollywood glamour. That sleepy-eyed, slow-moving sensuality wasn't mysterious allure. It was barbiturate intoxication. Photographers captured images of actresses looking ethereal and otherworldly when they were actually struggling to remain upright under pharmaceutical influence. The public consumed these images and aspired to that same dreamy elegance, not realizing it came from a bottle. Mixing barbiturates with alcohol produced particularly dangerous results. Both substances depressed the central nervous system, and combining them multiplied the effects exponentially rather than additively. One cocktail plus 2 seconals didn't equal 3 units of sedation. It equaled 7 or 8, sometimes more. The liver processed both substances using similar enzymatic pathways, becoming overwhelmed and shutting down its detoxification functions. Blood concentrations spiked unpredictably, sending users into respiratory depression without warning. Studio parties featured open bars and doctors distributing pills like party favors, creating dozens of opportunities for accidental overdose at every gathering. Publicists became expert at handling stars who passed out at industry events, whisking them away before photographers noticed and spinning the incidents as exhaustion or flu. The near misses piled up. Performers found unconscious in bathrooms, stars who stopped breathing and required emergency intervention, actors who drove home impaired and crashed their cars into trees or other vehicles. The deaths started slowly, spaced far enough apart that each could be treated as isolated tragedy rather than pattern. A character actor here, a supporting player there, people whose names meant little outside industry circles. Studios paid off coroners, influenced police investigations, and ensured death certificates listed vague causes that avoided mentioning barbiturates specifically. The phrase heart failure covered multitudes of pharmaceutical sins, but the system was unstable. You cannot run a major industry on mass drug dependency without eventually producing casualties too famous to ignore. The studios had built a beautiful, efficient machine for converting human beings into profitable products, and barbiturates were the lubricant that kept everything running smoothly. What they hadn't calculated was that machines eventually break down, and when they broke in Hollywood, they did so spectacularly and publicly, in ways that made continued denial impossible. The first crack appeared in 1962, and her name was Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe's relationship with barbiturates began long before she became the world's most famous blonde. Norma Jean Baker spent her childhood shuffling between foster homes and an orphanage, developing insomnia that would plague her entire life. The sleep disturbances stemmed from abandonment trauma, sexual abuse, and a mother committed to a psychiatric institution with paranoid schizophrenia. By the time she signed with 20th Century Fox in 1946, the sleepless nights had already established patterns that pills would later exploit. The studio system recognized her commercial potential immediately, but considered her raw material requiring refinement. They changed her hair from brown to platinum blonde using peroxide so harsh it damaged her scalp. They altered her name, her biography, and her entire public persona into something that bore little resemblance to the actual woman. The maintenance of this manufactured identity required constant performance, and performance anxiety made the existing insomnia catastrophic. Some nights she didn't sleep at all, staring at ceilings while her brain replayed every mistake and imagined future humiliations. Dr. Hyman Engelberg became her primary physician in the 1950s, prescribing barbiturates with enthusiasm that would later seem criminally negligent. Nembutal was his drug of choice initially, those yellow capsules that promised 8 hours of unconsciousness. Monroe took them nightly, then twice nightly when tolerance built, then supplemented them with chloral hydrate, a sedative dating back to the 1800s that tasted vile but worked when barbiturates alone failed. Engelberg wrote prescriptions for quantities that no reasonable physician would provide to a single patient. 60 capsules here, 90 there, refills available before the previous bottle ran empty. She also saw psychiatrist Dr. Ralph Greenson, who prescribed his own medications without coordinating with Engelberg. This meant Monroe received multiple prescriptions for the same drugs from different doctors, all legally, all documented in medical records that nobody cross-referenced. The overlap created dangerous redundancy, where she could consume double or triple the intended doses while technically following each doctor's instructions. Both physicians later claimed ignorance of the other's prescribing, though this required impressive dedication to not asking obvious questions. The pills ruled her daily existence by the late 1950s. Mornings required stimulants to counteract the barbiturate hangover, dexedrine or pharmaceutical cocaine, that Greenson provided for energy and appetite suppression. Afternoons brought anxiety that demanded Miltown or Equinil, early tranquilizers marketed as milder than barbiturates but still dependency-forming. Evenings meant returning to the heavy sedatives, cycling back to Nembutal or Seconal as her body screamed for the chemical shutdown it had learned to require. Friends described visiting her home and finding her in various states of consciousness throughout the day. She would answer the door barely able to stand, words slurred into incomprehensibility, then somehow rally for a photo shoot hours later. Other times she seemed perfectly normal until mid-conversation, when her eyes would glaze over and she'd lose track of what she was saying. The pills created a permanent fog that lifted only briefly when stimulants punched through, giving her small windows of clarity before the sedation reasserted itself. Studio executives at 20th Century Fox knew exactly what was happening, but cared only about whether she could work. During the filming of Something's Got to Give in 1962, she missed so many days due to drug-induced incapacity that the production fell catastrophically behind schedule. Directors waited for hours while she remained unconscious in her dressing room, unable to be roused by assistants or doctors. When she did appear on set, she frequently couldn't remember her lines or hit her marks, requiring dozens of takes for simple scenes. The studio fired her in June 1962, claiming unprofessional behavior and breach of contract. This devastated Monroe because work was her primary identity. Without films, who was she except a drug-dependent woman approaching 40 in an industry that worshipped youth? The firing also meant losing the structure that imposed some regularity on her drug use. When shooting demanded her presence at specific times, she at least had external forces limiting consumption. Unemployed, she had nothing to stop her from taking pills whenever anxiety or insomnia struck, which meant nearly constantly. Her tolerance had reached genuinely terrifying levels by summer 1962. Doses that would have killed non-tolerant users barely affected her. She reportedly took 40 to 50 Nembutal capsules per week, each containing 100 milligrams of pentobarbital. Simple math revealed she was consuming 4 to 5 grams of barbiturates weekly, enough to put a dozen people into comas. Her liver struggled to process this chemical assault, gradually losing efficiency as hepatocytes died and were replaced by scar tissue. The isolation grew worse as her behavior became more erratic. She called friends at 3 a.m, rambling incoherently or crying about perceived slights. She made and cancelled plans repeatedly, forgetting commitments or becoming too sedated to leave her house. People who cared about her watched helplessly as she spiraled, recognizing the drug dependency but lacking any framework for intervention. Addiction treatment in 1962 consisted mainly of moral judgment and psychiatric institutionalization, neither of which seemed helpful. August 4, 1962 started ordinarily enough. Monroe spent the afternoon at her Brentwood home, making phone calls and seeing a few visitors. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, noticed nothing particularly alarming. Monroe seemed sedated, but that was normal. Dr. Greenson visited in the late afternoon for a therapy session, later claiming she appeared somewhat depressed but not suicidal. He left around 7 in the evening, instructing Murray to call if anything changed. The timeline of that night remains disputed, contradictory and suspicious. Murray claimed she noticed a light under Monroe's bedroom door around midnight and became concerned because Monroe usually slept in darkness. She called Dr. Greenson, who arrived around 3:30 a.m. according to some accounts, earlier according to others. They found the bedroom door locked and Monroe unresponsive on her bed. Greenson broke a window to enter, discovering her naked, face down, phone in hand, clearly dead. The official timeline made no sense. If Murray noticed the light at midnight and immediately worried, why wait over 3 hours to call the doctor? If she called earlier, why did Greenson take so long to arrive at a house 15 minutes from his office? Why was the first call to police not made until 4:25 a.m., when Monroe was obviously dead hours earlier? The delays suggested people were making other calls first, getting stories straight, possibly removing evidence. Dr. Engelberg arrived and pronounced her dead, though later testimony conflicted about who arrived, when, and what condition the room was in. The Los Angeles Police Department began an investigation that immediately encountered resistance from powerful people with strong motivations to obscure the truth. Monroe had been involved with President John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert, affairs that would have created political scandals if fully documented. The connections to organized crime figures, studio executives, and intelligence agencies created a web of people who benefited from a quick, quiet conclusion. The autopsy began on August 5th, conducted by Dr. Thomas Noguchi, a careful pathologist who would later become famous as coroner to the stars. His findings were professionally meticulous and deeply strange. Monroe's blood contained 8.0 mg% of chloral hydrate and 4.5 mg% of Nembutol, both at lethal concentrations. Her liver showed even higher levels, 13.0 mg% pentobarbital, indicating massive consumption shortly before death. But here was the problem. Her stomach was nearly empty. The autopsy found no significant pill residue in her digestive system, no partially dissolved capsules, no characteristic yellow staining that Nembutol left on stomach tissue. Someone who swallowed enough barbiturates to produce blood concentrations that high should have had a stomach full of dissolving pills. The absence suggested the drugs entered her system through another route, possibly suppository administration, possibly injection, possibly a method that bypassed her digestive system entirely. Noguchi noted additional anomalies. Bruising on her back and hips suggested she'd been handled roughly or had fallen repeatedly. Her colon showed discoloration consistent with recent enema administration, though no equipment was found at the scene. The phone clutched in her hand implied she was trying to call someone when she lost consciousness, but phone records from that night mysteriously disappeared. Her diary, which friends said she maintained religiously, and which reportedly contained details about her relationships with the Kennedy brothers, was never found. The official conclusion came swiftly: probable suicide due to acute barbiturate poisoning. This verdict required believing several improbable things simultaneously. It meant accepting that Monroe took a fatal dose of pills that left no trace in her stomach. It meant ignoring the 3-hour delay in reporting her death and the contradictory witness statements. It meant dismissing evidence suggesting other people had been in the house during her final hours. It meant overlooking that someone who wanted to kill herself would lock her bedroom door from inside, preventing discovery and rescue. The psychiatric evaluation that labelled her suicidal came from Dr. Greenson, who had financial and professional incentives to frame her death as inevitable rather than preventable. Claiming she'd been depressed and expressing suicidal ideation protected him from malpractice liability for prescribing the drugs that killed her. The conclusion also protected the studio, the Kennedy family, and everyone else whose reputations would suffer if Monroe's death was investigated as the suspicious, possibly criminal event it appeared to be. Toxicology couldn't determine time of death precisely, but estimations based on rigor mortis and body temperature suggested she died between 9:30 p.m. and midnight, hours before anyone officially claimed to have found her. This gap allowed time for people to enter and leave the property, remove evidence, and coordinate stories. Neighbours reported seeing unusual activity at Monroe's house that night, including vehicles arriving and departing, but police never seriously investigated these accounts. The funeral occurred on August 8th, a small service attended by 30 people that Joe DiMaggio arranged after excluding most of Hollywood's elite. He blamed the industry for killing her through exploitation and drug dependency, which was essentially correct. DiMaggio banned Frank Sinatra, Peter Lawford, and other members of Monroe's social circle, recognizing that many had enabled her addiction or used her for their own purposes. He placed red roses on her grave 3 times weekly for 20 years, a gesture of love that couldn't change the fact that she died alone, possibly murdered, definitely destroyed by an industry that consumed people and discarded the remains. The official story satisfied nobody who examined it critically. The death scene was wrong. The timeline was wrong. The autopsy findings contradicted the suicide conclusion. But powerful forces wanted the case closed, and in 1962 Los Angeles, what powerful forces wanted they typically received. The investigation ended quickly, the contradictions were ignored, and Marilyn Monroe's death was filed away as another tragic Hollywood suicide by barbiturate overdose. She was 36 years old and had been taking the pills for nearly 15 years. Marilyn Monroe's death should have triggered immediate investigations into Hollywood's pharmaceutical practices, but the industry learned nothing except how to hide bodies more efficiently. The pattern established with Monroe, suspicious circumstances, compliant coroners, quick closures, became the template for handling subsequent barbiturate deaths. Studios refined their crisis management, ensuring that when stars died with pills in their system, the narrative was controlled before police finished processing the scene. The deaths multiplied because the underlying system remained unchanged, churning through performers whose dependency had progressed past the point where survival was likely. Judy Garland outlived Monroe by 7 years, though calling it living was generous. MGM had started feeding her amphetamines and barbiturates at 14, and by her 40s the accumulated damage was catastrophic. Her liver resembled that of a 60-year-old alcoholic, despite relatively moderate drinking, the result of decades processing pharmaceutical poison. Hepatocytes died and were replaced by scar tissue that couldn't perform normal detoxification functions. Her kidneys showed similar deterioration, struggling to filter blood already compromised by failing liver function. The organs that should have protected her from drug toxicity had been destroyed by the very substances they were trying to eliminate. She attempted suicide multiple times, or at least made gestures that looked like suicide attempts to people who didn't understand the blurred line between accidental overdose and deliberate self-destruction. When tolerance reaches certain levels, users lose track of how many pills they've taken. They swallow a handful, wait 30 minutes, forget they took any, and swallow more. The difference between trying to sleep and trying to die becomes academic when consciousness itself is fragmentary and unreliable. Garland's final performance occurred at a Copenhagen concert in March 1969, 3 months before she died. She could barely stand, forgot lyrics to songs she'd sung thousands of times, and left the stage after 45 minutes of a scheduled 90-minute show. The audience booed. Critics wrote savage reviews about a has-been who should retire with dignity rather than embarrass herself publicly. None recognised they were watching the final stages of barbiturate toxicity in a woman whose brain had been systematically destroyed since adolescence. June 22, 1969, her new husband, Mickey Deans, found her dead in the bathroom of their London apartment. She'd locked the door, sat on the toilet, and apparently lost consciousness there, slumping forward in a position that suggested she'd been trying to stay awake but failed. The autopsy revealed an incautious self-overdosage of barbiturates, specifically Seconal, the same red devils that had been her nighttime companion for decades. Her blood concentration wasn't extraordinarily high by her tolerance standards, but her liver could no longer metabolize the drugs effectively. What would have been survivable years earlier proved fatal because her body's defense mechanisms had been depleted. She was 47 and looked 70. The coroner officially ruled accidental death, noting that while the barbiturate level was elevated, it wasn't consistent with deliberate suicide. This distinction mattered legally while changing nothing about the fundamental reality. The pills MGM gave her at 14 killed her at 47, with 33 years of dependency in between. Louis B. Mayer died in 1957, spared having to answer for the children he'd destroyed in pursuit of box office returns. Alan Ladd presented a different archetype, the leading man whose masculinity was pharmaceutical artifice. He built his career playing tough guys in films like Shane and The Blue Dahlia, projecting strength and stoic resilience that required chemical maintenance behind the scenes. Ladd was short, insecure about his height, and struggled with depression that intensified as his career declined in the late 1950s. The pills that once helped him sleep became the only reliable comfort as younger actors replaced him in the roles that defined his identity. January 29, 1964, Ladd was found dead in his Palm Springs home. The official cause was listed as accidental overdose from a combination of alcohol and sedatives, though the specifics remained deliberately vague. His blood alcohol was elevated, and barbiturates were present in quantities that weren't individually lethal, but became so in combination. The ruling of accidental protected his reputation and insurance policies, though people close to him suspected suicide. His career had stalled, his marriage was troubled, and he'd been hospitalized multiple times for alcohol and drug-related issues. The investigation lasted less than a week. Police found no evidence of foul play. Doctors confirmed the cause of death aligned with the autopsy findings, and the case was closed with minimal scrutiny. Ladd was 50 years old and left behind a wife, children, and a filmography that people remembered while forgetting the man himself had been steadily disintegrating for years. His death generated headlines for a few days before the publicity machine moved on, already managing the next crisis. Inga Stevens died on April 30, 1970, found on her kitchen floor with lethal amounts of barbiturates in her system. The Los Angeles County coroner initially ruled suicide, noting she'd been depressed and had attempted suicide previously. But the investigation uncovered problems with that conclusion almost immediately. Stevens had seemed cheerful in the days before her death, was making plans for future projects, and had recently rekindled a relationship with a man named Ike Jones, whom she'd secretly married years earlier. Jones insisted she wouldn't have killed herself, and pointed to evidence suggesting she'd been with someone else the night she died. Witnesses placed an unidentified man at her house that evening. The barbiturate bottle found at the scene contained pills prescribed to someone else entirely. The lack of a suicide note seemed uncharacteristic for someone who had left detailed notes during previous attempts. Jones pushed for further investigation, but authorities had already moved on to other cases, satisfied that another troubled actress had taken the expected path of self-destruction. Later analysis suggested Stevens might have been murdered, with barbiturates forced into her either through injection or under duress. The bruising on her arms could have indicated struggle or restraint. The presence of another person's prescription medication implied someone else brought the drugs that killed her. But reopening the investigation would have required admitting the initial conclusion was premature, and Los Angeles law enforcement had developed impressive resistance to acknowledging mistakes involving dead celebrities. She was 35, beautiful, talented, and reduced to a suspicious death that nobody in power cared to examine honestly. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Find body, confirm barbiturates, rule suicide or accident, close file. The system had been refined through practice into an efficient process for disposing of inconvenient questions about dead performers whose continued existence would have demanded uncomfortable answers about pharmaceutical dependency and medical malpractice. Dorothy Kilgallen died under circumstances so suspicious they spawned conspiracy theories that persist today. The journalist and television personality had been investigating President Kennedy's assassination, claiming she had information that would blow the case open. On November 8, 1965, she was found dead in her Manhattan townhouse, sitting upright in bed wearing full makeup and clothing she hadn't worn the previous evening. Books were arranged around her that she'd already finished reading days before. Nothing about the scene suggested natural death. The autopsy revealed a barbiturate alcohol combination in her system, specifically seconal and tunal mixed with enough alcohol to enhance their sedative effects dramatically. The official ruling came quickly: accidental overdose resulting from taking medications while drinking. This required believing that Kilgallen, who'd taken barbiturates for years and understood their interaction with alcohol, accidentally killed herself by mixing substances she knew were dangerous in combination. It also required ignoring that someone had apparently dressed her, applied her makeup, and staged the death scene after she lost consciousness. Her notes on the Kennedy assassination disappeared. Files she'd been compiling vanished from her home. The police investigation focused on confirming the overdose, rather than questioning why a professional journalist with no history of suicidal ideation would suddenly kill herself in such a theatrical manner. The case closed within days, and the media moved on despite glaring inconsistencies that suggested murder rather than accident or suicide. Kilgallen was 52 and had made enemies among powerful people who didn't appreciate her investigative journalism. Her death silenced questions about Kennedy's murder while raising new questions about her own, though those went largely unexamined by authorities satisfied with the barbiturate explanation. Pills provided convenient cover for eliminating inconvenient people because the methodology was indistinguishable from accidents that happened frequently in a heavily medicated population. The medical examiners conducting these autopsies operated in an environment where barbiturate deaths had become routine. By the mid-1960s, Los Angeles County alone processed hundreds of barbiturate-related fatalities annually. Overworked pathologists developed shortcuts and assumptions that served efficiency over accuracy. Finding pills at a death scene and barbiturates in blood samples led automatically to conclusions of suicide or accident without deeper investigation into whether the deceased actually took the pills voluntarily or whether someone else administered them. Coroners' offices maintained friendly relationships with studios, police departments, and wealthy families who all benefited from quick, tidy conclusions that avoided scandal. A suspicious death that might indicate murder required extensive investigation, courtroom testimony, and public attention that reflected poorly on law enforcement's ability to protect citizens. An accidental overdose or suicide required only a toxicology report and a signature, disposing of the case efficiently while sparing everyone involved the complications of honesty. This institutional bias toward convenient conclusions created perfect conditions for getting away with murder via barbiturate administration. If someone wanted to kill a drug-dependent person, forcing or tricking them into taking a fatal dose produced a death that looked exactly like the accidental overdoses happening constantly throughout Hollywood. The victim's history of drug use provided built-in plausibility. Their tolerance made it difficult to determine whether the final dose was voluntary or forced. Their social circle was full of other drug users who could have provided pills, creating ambiguity about the source. The deaths clustered in patterns that suggested more than coincidence. Between 1962 and 1970, at least 15 major Hollywood figures died from barbiturate overdoses, either alone or in combination with alcohol. The actual number was likely higher because many deaths got classified as heart failure or natural causes when families paid for private autopsies and friendly conclusions. Each death was treated as isolated tragedy rather than data point in an emerging pattern of pharmaceutical carnage enabled by negligent doctors and indifferent institutions. Character actors, supporting players, and behind-the-scenes talent died in even greater numbers without generating headlines. Stunt performers, costume designers, and screenwriters didn't merit front-page obituaries when they succumbed to the same pills that killed the stars. Their deaths were processed through the same coroner's office pipeline with even less scrutiny, because nobody cared enough to ask questions about people who weren't famous. The true body count of Hollywood's barbiturate era will never be known because most victims died anonymously. Each death followed the familiar script: tolerance build up over months or years, escalating doses chasing the original effect, mixing with alcohol or other sedatives, and a final night where the balance tipped from unconsciousness into coma and respiratory failure. The body would be found hours or days later, usually alone, surrounded by pill bottles and often clutching a phone, as if trying to call for help before losing consciousness. Autopsies confirmed what everyone already knew: barbiturates in lethal concentrations, and the case would close with a shrug and paperwork stamped accidental or suicide. The survivors carried permanent damage. Performers who managed to quit barbiturates or reduce their consumption discovered their brains no longer functioned normally. Memory problems, emotional instability, and cognitive impairment persisted years after the last pill. The drugs had rewired neural pathways in ways that couldn't be reversed, leaving users permanently altered even in sobriety. Some developed seizure disorders from the brain damage. Others experienced depression and anxiety worse than what they'd initially tried to treat with pills. But Hollywood kept producing new stars to feed into the same system, each generation learning the pharmaceutical ropes from the previous one, passing down the vitamin routine like professional wisdom. The deaths were written off as the cost of doing business in an industry built on impossible beauty standards and inhuman work schedules. As long as the box office remained profitable, what did it matter if the talent occasionally died in bathrooms and bedrooms with empty pill bottles beside them? The answer was becoming increasingly obvious. It mattered a great deal, and eventually the bodies would pile high enough that even willfully blind institutions would be forced to look. The brain's GABA system evolved to regulate anxiety, fear, and arousal through careful chemical balance maintained over millions of years of evolution. Gamma-aminobutyric acid acts as the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. binding to receptors that reduce neuronal activity and produce calm, relaxation, and eventually sleep. The system functions beautifully in its natural state, responding to stress with measured chemical responses that prevent panic while maintaining alertness when danger threatens. Barbiturates hijacked this elegant mechanism with the subtlety of a sledgehammer through a plate glass window. When someone takes their first barbiturate, the drug floods GABA receptors throughout the central nervous system, artificially amplifying inhibitory signals beyond anything evolution intended. The effect feels miraculous. Anxiety evaporates, racing thoughts slow to manageable pace, physical tension releases, and sleep arrives easily. This initial experience creates powerful psychological associations. Pills equal relief, relief equals survival, therefore pills equal survival. The brain begins associating chemical intervention with the ability to function, laying groundwork for dependency before physical addiction even begins. The neurological response to repeated barbiturate exposure follows predictable patterns that were well documented in medical literature by the 1950s, though doctors kept prescribing anyway. GABA receptors, constantly overstimulated by pharmaceutical intervention, become desensitized to reduce the excessive inhibitory signaling. The brain grows additional receptors to compensate, trying to restore normal baseline function despite the chemical interference. Neurons adjust their firing thresholds, requiring stronger stimulation to activate because the system has adapted to constant sedation. This adaptation is tolerance, and it develops with mechanical inevitability in anyone taking barbiturates regularly. The dose that produced 8 hours of sleep initially barely causes drowsiness after a month. Users increase their consumption to recapture the original effect, but the brain adjusts to the new dose as well, requiring further increases in an escalating spiral. The therapeutic window, the range between a dose that works and a dose that kills, narrows dangerously as tolerance builds. A chronic user might take 10 times the standard dose just to feel normal, while remaining only 2 or 3 times that amount away from fatal overdose. The liver's role in this process created additional complications that Hollywood studio doctors either didn't understand or chose to ignore. Hepatic enzymes metabolize barbiturates through cytochrome P450 pathways, breaking down the drugs into inactive metabolites for excretion. Chronic exposure induces the liver to produce more of these enzymes, processing barbiturates more efficiently and reducing their duration of action. This means regular users not only need higher doses to achieve the same effect, but also need to dose more frequently as their enhanced metabolism clears the drugs from their system faster. The liver's adaptive response eventually becomes counterproductive. Years of processing massive drug quantities damages hepatocytes, replacing functional tissue with scar tissue that can't perform normal metabolic functions. Cirrhosis develops even without alcohol consumption, though most barbiturate users also drank, accelerating the hepatic destruction. A damaged liver processes drugs unpredictably, sometimes metabolizing them too slowly and causing dangerous accumulation, other times breaking them down into toxic intermediates that cause additional harm. Barbiturates accumulate in fatty tissues throughout the body, creating a reservoir that slowly leaches back into the bloodstream over days or weeks. Someone who stops taking the pills doesn't experience immediate clearance. The drugs continue circulating from fat stores, maintaining some level of sedation and dependency even during attempted abstinence. This accumulation effect made it nearly impossible to know exactly how much active drug was in someone's system at any given time, particularly in chronic users whose fatty tissues were saturated with barbiturates. Withdrawal from barbiturate dependency ranked among the most dangerous drug discontinuation syndromes known to medicine, more deadly than heroin or alcohol withdrawal. When someone physically dependent on barbiturates stops taking them suddenly, the brain's GABA system rebounds violently. All those extra receptors that developed during chronic use suddenly lack stimulation, creating a state of hyperexcitability where neurons fire uncontrollably. Seizures begin within 12 to 24 hours, sometimes progressing to status epilepticus, continuous seizures that cause permanent brain damage or death, if not treated immediately. The hallucinations during barbiturate withdrawal were particularly horrifying. Users reported seeing insects crawling under their skin, feeling phantom sensations of bugs in their hair, or watching walls breathe and melt. Auditory hallucinations produced voices calling their names or whispering threats. Tactile hallucinations made them feel like they were on fire or freezing despite normal body temperature. These sensory distortions stemmed from neurons misfiring wildly without the inhibitory control barbiturates had provided, creating perception without external stimuli. Delirium tremens during barbiturate withdrawal exceeded even the infamous DTs from alcohol cessation. Body temperature spiked to dangerous levels, sometimes reaching 105 or 106 degrees Fahrenheit and causing permanent organ damage. Blood pressure fluctuated wildly, swinging from dangerously low to stroke-inducing high within hours. Heart rate became erratic, producing arrhythmias that could trigger cardiac arrest. Tremors started in the hands and spread throughout the body, becoming so violent that users injured themselves thrashing against furniture or fell and cracked their skulls on floors. The psychiatric symptoms of withdrawal included paranoia, severe anxiety, and depression so profound that suicide seemed rational. Users became convinced people were plotting against them, that food was poisoned, or that family members had been replaced by imposters. These delusions felt absolutely real because the neurological dysfunction producing them was genuine. The brain's reward and fear centers, suddenly unregulated by GABAergic inhibition, generated emotions of overwhelming intensity without appropriate external triggers. Medical literature from the 1960s documented that barbiturate withdrawal killed approximately 1 in 20 patients who attempted to quit without medical supervision. This mortality rate approached that of untreated rabies or tetanus, placing barbiturate cessation among the most dangerous medical conditions someone could experience. The only safe method involved gradual dose reduction over weeks or months under physician supervision, substituting long-acting barbiturates for short-acting ones, and tapering by tiny increments that allowed the brain to readjust slowly. Hollywood studio doctors rarely supervise proper withdrawal protocols because doing so would have taken stars off the production schedule for extended periods. When performers tried to quit, they typically attempted it between films, giving themselves a few weeks to suffer through withdrawal alone or with minimal medical support. The agony of rapid cessation drove most back to the pills within days, convincing them they couldn't function without the drugs and reinforcing the dependency cycle. Those who succeeded in quitting often relapsed when the next production demanded 18-hour workdays and sleep on command. The combination of barbiturates and alcohol produced effects that mathematics alone couldn't predict. Both substances depress the central nervous system through different mechanisms. Alcohol enhances GABA's natural inhibitory effects, while barbiturates directly stimulate GABA receptors. The combination created synergistic depression, where 2 drinks plus 2 pills produce sedation equivalent to 6 or 7 drinks worth of impairment. The liver, forced to metabolize both substances simultaneously, became overwhelmed and shut down its detoxification processes entirely for periods, allowing blood concentrations to spike unpredictably. This synergy explained many of Hollywood's accidental overdoses. Someone tolerant to high barbiturate doses would take their usual amount, then have a few cocktails at a party without considering the interaction. The alcohol multiplied the sedative effect exponentially, pushing them from relaxed to comatose within an hour. Respiratory depression set in as the brainstem's breathing centers received excessive inhibitory signals, slowing respiration to dangerous levels. Blood oxygen dropped, carbon dioxide accumulated, and without intervention, the person simply stopped breathing entirely. The respiratory failure occurred gradually enough that observers often didn't recognize the danger until too late. Someone who appeared very drunk or deeply asleep was actually dying slowly from oxygen deprivation. By the time people realized the person couldn't be roused, significant brain damage from hypoxia had already occurred. Attempts at resuscitation often failed because the barbiturate alcohol combination suppressed the brainstem's automatic breathing reflexes so completely that even manual ventilation couldn't deliver enough oxygen to prevent death. Chronic barbiturate use created permanent changes in brain structure visible on autopsy. The cerebral cortex showed atrophy, actual shrinkage from neuronal death caused by years of chemical suppression. The hippocampus, crucial for memory formation, displayed reduced volume and neuronal density. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for judgment and impulse control, exhibited signs of accelerated aging with cell death patterns typically seen in people decades older. These structural changes meant that even if someone survived their dependency and achieved sobriety, their cognitive function never fully recovered. Memory problems plagued survivors particularly severely. Short-term memory formation depends on proper hippocampal function, which barbiturates disrupted even at therapeutic doses. Chronic users experienced blackouts where they functioned and interacted with people but formed no memories of the events. They would have entire conversations, make commitments, or engage in activities with no subsequent recollection. This amnesia extended beyond the period of intoxication. Years of barbiturate use damaged the brain's ability to form new long-term memories permanently. The emotional dysregulation that persisted after cessation stemmed from damage to limbic system structures that regulate mood and affect. The amygdala, which processes fear and emotional responses, became hyperreactive after years of being artificially dampened. Former users experienced anxiety, irritability, and emotional instability that made everyday stress feel overwhelming. Antidepressants and other psychiatric medications often failed to help because the underlying neurological damage couldn't be reversed by different drugs, attempting to rebalance a system that had been physically altered. Paradoxical reactions became more common with chronic use, where barbiturates produced effects opposite to their intended purpose. Some long-term users became agitated and anxious when taking pills that should have sedated them. Others experienced increased insomnia, lying awake despite doses that would have knocked out non-tolerant individuals. The neurological adaptations to chronic sedation sometimes overshot, creating brain states that resisted pharmaceutical intervention in any direction. These paradoxical effects drove users to increase doses further, convinced the problem was insufficient medication rather than excessive neurological damage. The medical establishment's response to mounting evidence of barbiturate dangers moved with glacial slowness. Research papers documenting addiction, withdrawal syndromes, and overdose deaths accumulated in journals throughout the 1950s and 1960s, yet prescribing practices remained largely unchanged. Doctors had been trained that barbiturates were safe and effective, and shifting that professional consensus required overcoming decades of pharmaceutical company marketing and institutional inertia. Admitting the drugs were dangerous meant acknowledging that physicians had been harming patients on massive scale for 50 years. Pharmaceutical companies actively obscured the dangers through selective research funding and aggressive marketing campaigns. Studies showing barbiturate safety received generous funding and wide publication, while research documenting problems faced funding difficulties and limited distribution. Sales representatives visited doctors' offices regularly, providing free samples and educational materials that emphasized therapeutic benefits while minimizing addiction risks. The companies positioned barbiturates as essential tools for modern medical practice, suggesting that doctors who didn't prescribe them were behind the times and depriving patients of effective treatment. By 1970, medical literature could no longer ignore the evidence. Over half of all drug-related emergency room visits involved barbiturates, either alone or in combination with alcohol. Overdose deaths exceeded those from all illegal drugs combined. The addiction rates among chronic users approached 100%, and the withdrawal syndrome's mortality rate made cessation without medical supervision effectively life-threatening. Yet even with this overwhelming documentation, barbiturates remained widely prescribed for conditions ranging from anxiety to insomnia to seizure disorders, with doctors assuring patients they were perfectly safe when taken as directed. The gap between medical evidence and medical practice revealed the power of institutional momentum and financial incentives. Changing prescribing patterns meant admitting error, retraining physicians, fighting pharmaceutical company lobbying, and accepting responsibility for an epidemic of addiction and death. It was easier to continue writing prescriptions while telling patients to be careful, shifting responsibility for safety to the users themselves rather than the medical system that had created and maintained their dependency. Hollywood's dead stars were just the most visible casualties of a broader medical catastrophe, enabled by negligence, greed, and willful ignorance. Post-war America transformed anxiety into a medical condition requiring pharmaceutical intervention, with women bearing the brunt of this aggressive medicalization. The 1950s housewife who felt dissatisfied with domestic confinement wasn't experiencing rational frustration with limited opportunities. She was diagnosed with neurosis, hysteria, or nervous exhaustion. Doctors prescribed tranquilizers and barbiturates at 3 times the rate for women compared to men, pathologizing normal emotional responses to abnormal social constraints. The pills became tools for maintaining social order, chemically adjusting women who resisted their prescribed roles rather than questioning why those roles generated so much distress. The pharmaceutical industry recognized this captive market and targeted advertising directly at physicians, portraying women as inherently unstable creatures requiring chemical management. Magazine advertisements in medical journals showed housewives looking anxious or overwhelmed, with text suggesting that Miltown, Librium, or barbiturates could restore them to compliant functionality. One infamous ad depicted a woman surrounded by household chaos, with the caption suggesting tranquilizers would help her cope with the demands of modern motherhood. The message was clear. Women's emotional responses to exhausting, isolating domestic labor were pathological rather than reasonable. Mother's Little Helper became cultural shorthand for the Valium and barbiturates that millions of housewives took daily just to endure their lives. The Rolling Stones wrote a song about it in 1966, capturing the grim reality of pharmaceutical dependency, normalized as routine self-care. Women who might have benefited from social change, meaningful work, or acknowledgement that their dissatisfaction was rational, instead received prescriptions that numbed them into acceptance. The doctors writing these prescriptions saw themselves as helping their patients cope, not recognizing they were participating in chemical oppression of an entire gender. Hollywood amplified these pressures exponentially because actresses faced expectations that exceeded even the impossible standards imposed on ordinary women. They needed to be thin but not gaunt, beautiful but approachable, sexy but wholesome, talented but not threatening to male egos. Maintaining this contradiction required constant self-monitoring and modification that generated anxiety no human could endure without breaking. The barbiturates provided temporary relief while ensuring the breaking happened slowly enough to extract maximum value before the final collapse. The medical establishment's view of barbiturates as harmless stemmed partly from their legal status and pharmaceutical origin. Street drugs were dangerous because criminals sold them. Prescribed drugs were safe because doctors provided them. This reasoning ignored pharmacology entirely in favor of authority-based safety assessments. A barbiturate obtained with a prescription and one bought from an illegal dealer were chemically identical, produced identical effects, and carried identical risks. But the prescription conferred legitimacy that prevented doctors from recognizing they were functioning as legal drug dealers destroying their patients' health. Specific physicians emerged as particularly egregious enablers, their practices so reckless they crossed from malpractice into criminal negligence. Max Jacobson, known as Dr. Feelgood, built his reputation injecting celebrities with cocktails containing amphetamines, barbiturates, steroids, and vitamins. His patient list included President Kennedy, Marilyn Monroe, Truman Capote, Tennessee Williams, and dozens of other prominent figures who received his injections before public appearances or performances. Jacobson's license was eventually revoked in 1975, but not before decades of operation during which he created and maintained dependencies in some of America's most influential people. Hyman Engelberg, Marilyn Monroe's primary physician, exemplified the studio-friendly doctor whose loyalty aligned with employers rather than patients. He prescribed barbiturates in quantities that no reasonable physician would provide, wrote prescriptions under various names to obscure the total amount, and failed to coordinate with Monroe's psychiatrist despite knowing she was receiving medications from multiple sources. After her death, Engelberg faced no meaningful consequences, no license suspension, no malpractice suits that succeeded, no criminal charges for what was effectively negligent homicide through pharmaceutical means. Ralph Greenson, Monroe's psychiatrist, practiced a form of therapy that involved seeing patients daily while prescribing medications that impaired their ability to engage in meaningful psychological work. He prescribed barbiturates, tranquilizers, and other sedatives while conducting psychoanalysis on a woman too drugged to benefit from insight-oriented treatment. The conflict of interest was staggering. He profited from frequent sessions necessitated partly by the medications he prescribed that prevented actual therapeutic progress. After Monroe's death, he wrote professionally about the case without acknowledging his role in maintaining her pharmaceutical dependency until it killed her. These doctors shared common characteristics that enabled their destructive practices. They maintained close relationships with studios or wealthy patrons whose financial interests they served. They wrote prescriptions for aliases or under multiple patient names to obscure total quantities. They ignored obvious signs of addiction and escalating tolerance, treating dose increases as routine medication adjustments rather than danger signals. They failed to maintain proper medical records or coordinate with other physicians treating the same patients. They viewed their role as keeping valuable assets functional rather than promoting long-term patient health. The studios maintained rosters of compliant physicians who understood the unspoken rules of Hollywood medical practice. These doctors received compensation beyond what they billed patients: consulting fees, retainers, gifts, and access to industry events that made them feel like insiders rather than employees. They signed non-disclosure agreements that prevented them from discussing patients' conditions or treatment, creating a wall of confidentiality that protected studios from liability. When stars died, these same doctors signed death certificates, provided statements to police, and testified at inquests in ways that shielded everyone involved from criminal or civil consequences. The prescription practices would have been obviously criminal if they involved illegal drugs. A doctor writing hundreds of opioid prescriptions per month for the same patient would face immediate investigation and likely criminal charges, But Barbiturates' legal status created a grey area where outrageous prescribing patterns could continue for years without regulatory intervention. Medical boards, understaffed and reluctant to police their own profession, rarely investigated physicians unless someone filed formal complaints. Studios and wealthy patients had no incentive to complain since they benefited from the arrangement. Multiple concurrent prescriptions from different doctors for the same medications created particularly dangerous situations. Monroe received barbiturates from both Engelberg and Greenson, neither apparently aware of or concerned about the other's prescribing. This meant she could consume double the intended dose while technically following each doctor's instructions. The lack of coordination extended across Hollywood, where stars routinely saw multiple physicians and psychiatrists simultaneously, accumulating prescriptions that interacted in ways no single doctor monitored. Pharmacy records weren't centralized in the 1950s and 1960s, making it impossible to track total prescriptions filled by an individual patient. Someone with prescriptions from 3 different doctors could fill them at 3 different pharmacies, and no system existed to flag the overlap. This allowed dangerous polypharmacy to continue unchecked, with patients consuming medication combinations that would have been immediately recognized as lethal if visible to a single clinician. The fragmented medical system enabled abuse through structural blindness to patterns that should have triggered intervention. The psychiatric establishment's embrace of pharmaceutical management over therapeutic intervention reflected broader trends in American medicine. Psychoanalysis and talk therapy were time-consuming and expensive, while pills were quick and profitable. Insurance companies preferred covering medication over extended therapy sessions. Patients wanted rapid relief rather than years of self-examination. Doctors found prescribing more efficient than listening to complex problems that might not have pharmaceutical solutions. The convergence of these factors created overwhelming momentum toward medicating mental distress rather than addressing its sources. Women received barbiturates for complaints that male patients wouldn't have generated prescriptions. A man describing workplace stress might receive advice about time management. A woman describing household stress received Nembutal. Male anxiety was normal response to challenging responsibilities. Female anxiety was pathological overreaction to manageable tasks. This double standard reflected cultural assumptions about gender differences in emotional stability and appropriate pharmaceutical intervention. The prescribing patterns reinforced and perpetuated stereotypes about women's inherent fragility, while ignoring that the fragility was often rational response to genuinely difficult circumstances. Hollywood's female stars experienced these gendered medical practices more intensely than their male counterparts. Actresses received barbiturates for anxiety about aging, weight gain, competition from younger performers, and the strain of maintaining impossible beauty standards. Actors received the same drugs less frequently, and when they did, it was typically for insomnia related to work stress rather than appearance anxiety. The differential prescribing reflected and reinforced cultural messages about women's value being primarily aesthetic, while men's value came from accomplishment and power. The medical literature of the era reveals how thoroughly doctors accepted these gendered assumptions. Research papers discussed the nervous housewife and female hysteria as legitimate diagnostic categories requiring pharmaceutical intervention. Studies examined which medications best controlled emotional outbursts or crying in female patients, framing normal emotional expression as symptoms requiring suppression. Male patients exhibiting similar emotional responses were less likely to be medicated and more likely to receive validating explanations about appropriate reactions to stress. Studios exploited this medical bias systematically. When actresses struggled with the demands of stardom, studio executives sent them to friendly doctors who would diagnose anxiety disorders and prescribe barbiturates. The drugs kept them compliant and working rather than demanding changes to brutal schedules or inhuman expectations. Male actors who complained about working conditions might receive contract renegotiations. Female actors received prescriptions. The pharmaceutical management of discontent prevented collective action or meaningful reform while maintaining the fiction that individual pathology rather than systemic exploitation was the problem. The complicity extended beyond individual doctors to the institutions that credentialed and regulated them. Medical schools taught that barbiturates were safe and effective without adequate coverage of addiction mechanisms or withdrawal dangers. Licensing boards accepted pharmaceutical company educational materials at face value rather than demanding independent verification of safety claims. Professional organizations like the American Medical Association endorsed barbiturates enthusiastically, providing credibility that enabled widespread prescribing while dismissing emerging evidence of harm as isolated cases or patient misuse rather than systematic problems. Pharmaceutical companies cultivated relationships with influential physicians who would promote their products through lectures, journal articles, and consultations. These thought leaders received speaking fees, research grants, and consulting contracts that created financial incentives to downplay barbiturate dangers while emphasizing benefits. Their endorsements carried weight with practicing physicians who assumed that respected experts wouldn't recommend dangerous treatments. The network of financial relationships between drug manufacturers, medical educators, and practicing clinicians created a system that prioritized profit over patient safety while maintaining a veneer of scientific objectivity. The regulatory environment of the 1950s and 1960s offered minimal oversight of prescription practices. The Food and Drug Administration had limited authority over how doctors prescribe medications once approved. The Drug Enforcement Administration didn't exist until 1973. Medical boards operated reactively rather than proactively, investigating doctors only after multiple complaints or obvious catastrophes. This regulatory vacuum allowed dangerous prescribing to continue essentially unchecked for decades, despite mounting evidence that barbiturates were killing people at epidemic rates. When celebrities died from barbiturate overdoses, their doctors typically faced no consequences. Coroners ruled the deaths accidental or suicide, which absolved physicians of responsibility. Malpractice suits rarely succeeded because establishing that prescribing fell below standard of care was difficult when the standard itself was dangerously permissive. Criminal prosecution required proving intentional harm rather than mere negligence, a burden that prosecutors rarely attempted to meet. The lack of accountability ensured that the doctors who enabled addiction and overdose continued practicing, often building their reputations on the very celebrity patients they'd helped destroy. The cultural moment demanded this level of pharmaceutical intervention to maintain a social order that was fundamentally unsustainable. Women couldn't actually be thin, beautiful, talented, submissive, sexually available yet publicly virginal, endlessly energetic and emotionally stable, while working 18-hour days for years on end. The contradiction required chemical management because human biology couldn't accommodate it otherwise. Barbiturates bridged the gap between what was demanded and what was possible, though the bridge was constructed from physiological damage and collapsed regularly beneath the weight of accumulated toxicity. Hollywood represented an intensified version of broader American patterns, where pharmaceutical solutions to social problems were preferred over addressing the problems themselves. Rather than questioning why so many women required tranquilizers and sleeping pills, the culture normalized their use as reasonable responses to the demands of modern life. The fact that earlier generations hadn't required such extensive medication was ignored in favor of explanations emphasizing the particular stresses of contemporary existence. The possibility that the stresses were artificial exploitative, and deliberately maintained to serve institutional interest was too threatening to examine honestly. The mounting death toll finally forced regulatory attention in 1965 when the Drug Abuse Control Amendments became the first federal legislation to classify barbiturates as dangerous drugs requiring strict controls. The law emerged from years of pressure by medical examiners, toxicologists, and public health officials who'd been documenting the carnage while watching their reports disappear into bureaucratic indifference. Emergency room physicians had been screaming about barbiturate overdoses for a decade, treating patients who arrived comatose or seizing while knowing that dozens more died at home before ambulances could arrive. The amendments represented acknowledgement that maybe, possibly, these widely prescribed medications were killing people at rates that exceeded automobile accidents. The medical community fought back with righteous indignation. The American Medical Association issued statements warning that restricting legitimate medicine would create unnecessary suffering for patients with genuine need for sedatives and sleeping pills. Pharmaceutical companies funded research emphasizing barbiturates' continued therapeutic utility while downplaying addiction risks. Individual physicians complained that government interference in medical practice violated professional autonomy and doctor-patient relationships. The resistance revealed how thoroughly the profession had invested in maintaining a system that benefited doctors and drug companies while destroying patients. Implementation of the new regulations moved with deliberate slowness. The amendments required more detailed record-keeping and limited prescription quantities, but enforcement relied on the same understaffed agencies that had failed to regulate barbiturates previously. Doctors could still prescribe them freely. They simply needed to document the prescriptions more carefully and couldn't write refills indefinitely. These minor procedural changes barely impacted prescribing patterns because the underlying culture that viewed barbiturates as safe remained intact. Pills continued flowing to anyone who complained of anxiety or insomnia, though now with slightly more paperwork. The death statistics kept climbing despite regulatory gestures toward control. By 1970, barbiturates were involved in over half of all drug-related deaths in the United States, surpassing automobiles, firearms, and illegal drugs combined as a cause of mortality. Emergency rooms treated thousands of overdoses monthly, consuming resources and physician time that could have served other patients. The economic costs alone, medical treatment, lost productivity, premature deaths, exceeded billions of dollars annually. Yet prescriptions remained at near-record levels because the infrastructure supporting widespread use was too profitable and too entrenched to dismantle quickly. The pharmaceutical industry had seen regulatory pressure coming and developed a solution that maintained profits while appearing to address safety concerns. Benzodiazepines, a newer class of drugs including Valium and Librium, were marketed as safer alternatives to barbiturates with lower overdose risk and less severe withdrawal syndromes. The companies positioned these medications as modern improvements that rendered barbiturates obsolete, conveniently ignoring that benzodiazepines created their own addiction problems and dangerous interactions with alcohol. The strategy worked brilliantly. Doctors switched patients to the new drugs while maintaining the fundamental approach of medicating anxiety and insomnia rather than addressing their causes. Hoffmann La Roche, manufacturer of Valium, launched one of the most aggressive pharmaceutical marketing campaigns in history during the late 1960s and early 1970s. The company spent millions on advertising, physician education, and free samples that positioned Valium as the solution to modern life stresses. Magazine advertisements showed housewives, business executives, and college students all benefiting from the little yellow pills that promised calm without impairment. By 1978, Valium was the most prescribed drug in America, with over 2.3 billion tablets sold annually. The The company had successfully convinced an entire culture that pharmaceutical mood management was not only acceptable, but preferable to addressing the sources of distress. The transition from barbiturates to benzodiazepines allowed everyone to pretend they'd learned from past mistakes while repeating them with slightly different chemistry. Doctors could claim they'd stopped prescribing dangerous drugs while writing prescriptions for equally dependency-forming medications. Patients felt reassured that their new pills were safer while developing identical patterns of tolerance and escalating use. The pharmaceutical industry celebrated innovation while profiting from the same business model that had worked so profitably with barbiturates. Nothing fundamental changed except the specific molecules generating revenue and addiction. Hollywood's most spectacular barbiturate deaths continued into the 1970s, despite increased regulation and public awareness. Jimi Hendrix died in September 1970 after consuming 9 Vesparax tablets, a particularly potent barbiturate combination that suppressed his breathing while he slept. The inquest ruled inhalation of vomit due to barbiturate intoxication, though questions remained about whether he'd taken the pills voluntarily or been given them by someone else. His death at 27 joined the growing list of young talents destroyed by drugs that doctors had assured them were medically legitimate. The counterculture drug epidemic of the late 1960s and early 1970s drew attention away from prescription drug abuse, even as both problems escalated simultaneously. Media coverage focused on heroin, marijuana, and LSD as threats to American youth, while largely ignoring that barbiturates killed more people than all illegal drugs combined. The distinction between pharmaceutical and street drugs created a false dichotomy, where one type generated moral panic, while the other remained socially acceptable despite higher body counts. Parents worried about their children experimenting with marijuana, while remaining blind to prescription bottles in their own medicine cabinets that posed far greater dangers. Rock music's embrace of barbiturates paralleled Hollywood's earlier adoption, with musicians discovering the same pills that had killed movie stars a decade earlier. The drugs provided relief from touring schedules that rivaled film production in their intensity, offering chemical management of performance anxiety and insomnia from constant travel across time zones. Janis Joplin died in October 1970 from a heroin overdose, but her autopsy revealed she'd been mixing heroin with alcohol and barbiturates, a combination that multiplied the respiratory depression from each substance. The polypharmacy made determining which drug delivered the fatal dose impossible, while ensuring that any of them could have. Medical literature by 1972 contained overwhelming documentation of barbiturate dangers that could no longer be ignored or minimized. Journals published comprehensive reviews of addiction mechanisms, withdrawal protocols, and overdose statistics that made continued widespread prescribing indefensible. The evidence wasn't new. Much of it had been available since the 1950s, but the accumulation and repetition finally penetrated professional consciousness in ways that earlier warnings hadn't. Younger physicians entering practice had been trained on the dangers and questioned why older doctors continued prescribing drugs that evidence clearly showed were killing patients. The 1970 Controlled Substances Act represented the federal government's most comprehensive attempt to regulate drug distribution and use. The legislation created 5 schedules classifying drugs by medical utility and abuse potential, with stricter controls on higher schedules. Barbiturates were distributed across Schedule 2, 3, and 4, depending on their specific formulation and abuse potential. Schedule 2 barbiturates required written prescriptions with no refills, while Schedule 3 and V allowed limited refills but mandated better record-keeping and reporting of prescriptions. The classification acknowledged officially what medical examiners had been saying for decades. Barbiturates were dangerous drugs with high addiction potential that required careful control. Pharmaceutical companies protested that the scheduling would restrict access for patients with legitimate medical needs, the same argument they'd used against every previous regulatory effort. The difference was that by 1970, the pile of corpses was too high to ignore and the excuses had worn thin. Public opinion had shifted as celebrities continued dying, and emergency rooms continued filling with overdose patients who'd obtained their pills legally from physicians. Prescription rates began declining gradually through the 1970s as regulatory pressure increased and alternatives became available. Doctors who'd written hundreds of barbiturate prescriptions monthly found themselves facing scrutiny from medical boards and potential legal liability. Some voluntarily reduced their prescribing, recognizing belatedly that they'd been harming patients. Others retired or had their licenses suspended for egregious prescribing patterns that finally triggered consequences. The most complicit physicians faced no punishment at all, protected by statutes of limitation and the difficulty of proving that prescribing practices that were once standard of care should be prosecuted retroactively. Emergency room visits for barbiturate overdoses peaked in 1973 and began declining afterward as prescriptions decreased and users switched to benzodiazepines or illegal drugs. The decline wasn't dramatic. Barbiturates remained widely prescribed through the 1970s and 1980s, but the trajectory had reversed for the first time since the drug's introduction 70 years earlier. Medical schools began teaching more extensively about addiction and overdose risks, training new physicians to approach sedatives with appropriate caution rather than the casual enthusiasm that had characterized earlier generations. The pharmaceutical industry adapted by diversifying into other drug classes and abandoning barbiturates as their primary sedative products. Companies that had made fortunes from Nembutal and Seconal shifted resources to manufacturing and marketing benzodiazepines, sleeping pills, and other psychoactive medications. The business model remained unchanged. Identify anxiety and insomnia as conditions requiring pharmaceutical intervention, market drugs as solutions, and minimize addiction risks. But the specific products evolved to match regulatory environments and medical fashion. Survivors of the barbiturate era carried permanent damage that manifested years after they'd stopped taking the pills. Neurological testing revealed cognitive impairments, memory problems, and executive function deficits that persisted despite years of sobriety. Brain imaging showed structural changes consistent with premature aging and neuronal death. The damage was irreversible, meaning that people who'd been prescribed barbiturates in their 20s lived with cognitive disabilities in their 50s and 60s that significantly impaired their quality of life. Some recovered addicts developed seizure disorders triggered by the neurological damage from years of barbiturate use and subsequent withdrawal. They required anticonvulsant medications for life, trading one pharmaceutical dependency for another, while managing the consequences of the original addiction. The seizures could be mild and infrequent or severe and regular, but they represented permanent alteration of brain function that medication could manage but not cure. The irony of requiring drugs to treat damage caused by different drugs was not lost on patients who'd been assured the original medications were perfectly safe. Depression and anxiety disorders plagued former barbiturate users at rates far exceeding the general population. The neurological changes induced by chronic GABA receptor manipulation created lasting dysregulation of mood and emotional response. Many required antidepressants or therapy indefinitely to manage symptoms that wouldn't have existed without the barbiturate exposure that supposedly treated similar symptoms decades earlier. The circular tragedy, using drugs to treat problems caused by previous drugs, illustrated the fundamental failure of approaching human distress as primarily pharmaceutical issue rather than psychological or social one. By 1980, barbiturate prescriptions had declined to less than 20% of their 1970 peak. though this still represented millions of prescriptions annually. The drugs hadn't disappeared, they remained available and were still prescribed for specific conditions, including some seizure disorders and anesthesia. But their use as first-line treatment for anxiety and insomnia had ended. Medical consensus had shifted toward viewing them as dangerous drugs, requiring careful justification rather than routine interventions for common complaints. The generational transition in medical practice contributed significantly to declining barbiturate use. Physicians trained in the 1950s who'd prescribed barbiturates liberally for decades gradually retired, taking their dangerous prescribing habits with them. Younger doctors who'd been educated on addiction mechanisms and overdose risks approached sedatives with appropriate caution, preferring non-pharmaceutical interventions or newer drugs with supposedly better safety profiles. The shift wasn't complete or uniform. Some older doctors continued prescribing barbiturates until they retired, and some younger doctors proved just as reckless with benzodiazepines. But the overall trend moved away from the casual prescribing that had characterized Hollywood's golden age. The cost of the barbiturate era was finally being calculated, and the numbers were staggering. Conservative estimates suggested at least 50,000 Americans died from barbiturate-related causes between 1950 and 1980, with the actual number likely much higher due to deaths misattributed to natural causes or other conditions. Hundreds of thousands more survived overdoses but sustained permanent brain damage. Millions experienced addiction that required years to overcome and left lasting neurological effects. The economic costs, medical treatment, lost productivity, premature deaths exceeded hundreds of billions in current dollars. Hollywood's contribution to that death toll was impossible to quantify precisely. Dozens of major stars died directly from barbiturates, but thousands of supporting actors, crew members, and industry workers died anonymously from the same causes. The studio system's enthusiastic adoption of pharmaceutical management had normalized practices that spread throughout the entertainment industry and influenced broader American culture. The glamorous images of sedated starlets helped sell barbiturates to millions of women who aspired to Hollywood elegance, without realizing it came from chemical dependency that frequently proved fatal. The regulatory response, when it finally came, arrived decades too late to help the generation of performers destroyed during Hollywood's golden age. Marilyn Monroe, Judy Garland, and the others who died in the 1960s might have survived if the 1970 Controlled Substances Act had been passed 20 years earlier. Their deaths eventually contributed to the regulatory changes that protected later potential victims, but that legacy provided cold comfort to the families and fans mourning talents destroyed by drugs their doctors assured them were perfectly safe. The studio system collapsed through the 1960s and 1970s, killed partly by television competition and changing audience tastes, but also by its inability to maintain control over talent once the pharmaceutical management system became public knowledge. Actors who understood they'd been systematically drugged and exploited demanded contract changes and independent representation. The 7-year contracts that had enabled total control disappeared as performers recognized they'd signed away not just their professional lives but their physical and mental health. The old moguls who'd built empires on beautiful, compliant, chemically dependent stars found themselves unable to operate in an environment where drugs were acknowledged as tools of exploitation rather than medical necessity. The deaths of Monroe and Garland became cultural touchstones representing the dark underbelly of Hollywood glamour, though the lessons learned were superficial and temporary. Books and films portrayed them as tragic figures destroyed by their own demons, neatly obscuring the systemic forces that had created and maintained those demons. The narrative of personal weakness proved more comfortable than examining institutional responsibility, framing their deaths as individual failures rather than industrial casualties, allowed the entertainment industry to continue similar practices with different drugs and different victims, while claiming to have learned from past mistakes. Contemporary actors and musicians still struggle with prescription drug addiction at rates far exceeding the general population, though the specific chemicals have changed. OxyContin and other opioids replaced barbiturates as the prescription drugs most likely to kill celebrities, following the same pattern of medical legitimization masking dangerous addiction. Doctors prescribe pain medications liberally to performers whose bodies break down under the physical demands of their work, creating dependencies that mirror the barbiturate era with remarkable precision. The chemistry differs, but the fundamental dynamic, pharmaceutical management of workers to maintain productivity despite unsustainable demands, remains unchanged. Heath Ledger's death in 2008 from combined drug intoxication involving oxycodone, hydrocodone, diazepam, temazepam, alprazolam, and doxylamine revealed the modern version of polypharmacy that killed Monroe. Multiple doctors prescribed multiple medications without coordination, allowing dangerous combinations that each physician might have individually justified but collectively proved fatal. The toxicology report read like a pharmacology textbook chapter on central nervous system depressants, with 6 different drugs all working synergistically to suppress breathing until it stopped. He was 28 and left behind prescriptions from at least 3 different physicians who claimed not to know about each other's medications. Prince died in 2016 from fentanyl toxicity that investigations revealed stemmed from chronic pain management that had progressed to addiction over decades. The circumstances mirrored the barbiturate deaths from 50 years earlier. Tolerance requiring escalating doses, mixing medications from multiple sources, and a final night where the balance tipped from sedation into respiratory failure. He was found alone in an elevator, having collapsed while heading to an appointment with an addiction specialist scheduled for the day after he died. The timing was cruelly typical of overdose deaths that occur just as victims are finally seeking help, though help had come decades too late to prevent the dependency that killed him. Michael Jackson's death in 2009 involved propofol, a powerful anesthetic administered by a personal physician who functioned as a legal drug dealer in a white coat. Dr. Conrad Murray was eventually convicted of involuntary manslaughter for providing medications that killed his patient, but the conviction represented rare accountability in a system where doctors typically face no consequences for creating and maintaining celebrity dependencies. Murray's trial revealed that Jackson was receiving propofol nightly to induce sleep, essentially undergoing general anesthesia daily because lesser sedatives no longer worked after years of tolerance build-up. The practice was so obviously dangerous that Murray's conviction surprised nobody except perhaps Murray himself. The opioid epidemic that killed over 500,000 Americans between 1999 and 2019 followed the barbiturate template with eerie precision. Pharmaceutical companies assured doctors that opioids were safe and non-addictive when used for pain management, exactly as barbiturate manufacturers had claimed their drugs were safe for anxiety and insomnia. Purdue Pharma's marketing of OxyContin replicated the aggressive physician education campaigns that Bayer and Abbott used to promote Veronal and Nembutal decades earlier. The companies funded research emphasizing benefits while minimizing addiction risks, trained sales representatives to downplay dangers, and created an epidemic of dependency that enriched them while destroying communities. The legal response to the opioid crisis, lawsuits, settlements, and criminal charges against pharmaceutical executives, represented the accountability that never materialized during the barbiturate era. Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy in 2019 after thousands of lawsuits, and members of the Sackler family who owned the company agreed to pay billions in settlements. These consequences arrived too late for the hundreds of thousands already dead, but established precedent that pharmaceutical companies could be held responsible for epidemics they created through deceptive marketing. The barbiturate manufacturers escaped similar accountability because the deaths were spread over decades, and cultural attitudes toward corporate responsibility were less developed. Benzodiazepine dependency affects an estimated 1 to 2 million Americans currently. Many prescribe the drugs for anxiety or insomnia by physicians who either don't recognize addiction potential or don't care. The withdrawal syndrome from benzodiazepines rivals barbiturate withdrawal in severity and danger, with seizures, hallucinations, and occasionally death occurring in patients who stop suddenly. Yet doctors continue prescribing them long-term, despite guidelines recommending brief courses of weeks rather than months or years. The medical establishment learned almost nothing from the barbiturate catastrophe, simply substituting newer drugs into the same destructive patterns. The entertainment industry's relationship with substance abuse continues because the fundamental pressures that drove barbiturate use still exist. Performers work impossible schedules under intense scrutiny, facing career extinction if they age, gain weight, or fail to maintain the images that made them valuable. The anxiety and insomnia these pressures generate are rational responses to irrational demands, yet the solution remains pharmaceutical rather than structural. Studios and record labels no longer employ doctors to distribute pills directly, but they maintain relationships with physicians known to be sympathetic to performer needs, which translates to liberal prescribing practices. The romanticization of the tortured artist narrative obscures the reality that many weren't tortured by their art, but by the industries exploiting them. Monroe wasn't destroyed by the demands of acting, but by studio executives who worked her to exhaustion, and doctors who drugged her to maintain productivity. Garland's struggles stemmed not from her talent, but from being given amphetamines as a teenager, to suppress her appetite and barbiturates to counteract the amphetamines. The mythology of innate artistic suffering provides cover for industrial practices that deliberately create the suffering that supposedly produces great art. Current celebrities who die from prescription drug overdoses generate news coverage emphasizing their personal struggles with addiction, while typically omitting the system-level factors that enabled their dependencies. The reporting focuses on the individual's choices and demons, rather than examining why physicians prescribed dangerous medication combinations, or why work demands required chemical management to fulfill. This framing maintains the profitable fiction that addiction is personal failure rather than often being industrial injury inflicted by systems that value productivity over human welfare. Social media has added new pressures that barbiturates couldn't have anticipated, but that generate similar demands for pharmaceutical management. Performers must maintain constant online presence, responding to fans and critics, while projecting perfect lives that bear little resemblance to reality. The emotional labor of managing public personas across multiple platforms while dealing with harassment and criticism would overwhelm anyone without chemical assistance. Anxiety medications, sleeping pills, and stimulants help celebrities maintain the always-on accessibility that social media demands while destroying their mental and physical health in ways that parallel earlier eras. The regulatory frameworks developed in response to the barbiturate crisis have proven inadequate for addressing subsequent pharmaceutical epidemics. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 was supposed to prevent the kind of widespread prescription drug abuse that killed Monroe and Garland, yet it failed to stop the opioid epidemic or prevent ongoing benzodiazepine dependency affecting millions. The problem isn't inadequate regulation, but rather systemic factors that prioritize pharmaceutical solutions to human problems, value corporate profits over public health, and resist acknowledging that many conditions being medicated are rational responses to pathological social conditions. Prescription monitoring programs implemented in most states during the 2000s and 2010s represent attempts to prevent the polypharmacy that killed Monroe through multiple prescriptions from different doctors. These databases flag patients receiving controlled substances from multiple sources and alert physicians to potential abuse patterns. However, they're ineffective when doctors ignore the warnings or when patients obtain prescriptions using different names or out-of-state physicians. The technical solution addresses symptoms while leaving intact the culture of overprescribing and the economic incentives that reward physicians for writing prescriptions rather than providing time-intensive care. The medical community still struggles with the question of how to treat genuine anxiety, insomnia, and pain without creating dependencies that become more problematic than the original conditions. Non-pharmaceutical interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy, exercise, and stress reduction techniques work for many patients, but are time-consuming, expensive, and require effort that pills don't. Insurance companies preferentially cover medication over therapy because pills are cheaper in the short term, though they create long-term costs from addiction treatment, overdose care, and management of pharmaceutical damage. The perverse incentive structure ensures that the easiest path for doctors and patients involves prescribing drugs known to be dangerous. The parallels between the barbiturate era and contemporary pharmaceutical crises reveal fundamental problems in how American medicine approaches human suffering. Pain, anxiety, and insomnia are typically symptoms of deeper issues: physical problems, social circumstances, or psychological distress that require addressing root causes rather than suppressing symptoms. Pharmaceutical intervention provides rapid relief but rarely solves underlying problems, while creating new problems through side effects and dependency. The medical system's preference for pharmaceutical solutions reflects both genuine limitations of alternatives and financial incentives that make prescribing far more profitable than comprehensive care. Hollywood's golden age ended because the foundation was built on exploitation and chemical dependency that proved unsustainable. The studios could manufacture stars and control their images as long as the stars remained functional, but barbiturates eventually destroyed the people they were meant to maintain. The death rate climbed until the system collapsed under the weight of corpses it produced, and survivors too damaged to continue working. The specific methods of control evolved. Modern contracts are less overtly exploitative, and pharmaceutical management is less centralized. But the fundamental dynamic of extracting maximum value from performers through any means necessary continues. The barbiturate era demonstrated that legal, medically prescribed drugs could be more dangerous than illegal substances, though this lesson has required relearning with each new class of pharmaceuticals. The legitimacy conferred by prescription pads and physician recommendations provided false security that allowed dependencies to develop unchecked. Users trusted that drugs provided by doctors with medical degrees must be safe, not recognizing that medical training doesn't prevent negligence, greed, or willful blindness when financial incentives align with overprescribing. The bodies buried in Hollywood's foundation represent not just individual tragedies, but industrial casualties of a system that valued profit over human life. Monroe, Garland, and dozens of others died because studios needed compliant workers, and doctors provided the chemicals to manufacture compliance. Their deaths eventually contributed to regulatory changes that saved later victims, though those changes came too late and have proven insufficient to prevent similar epidemics with different drugs. The pattern repeats because the underlying values that created the barbiturate crisis, prioritizing productivity over welfare, treating people as assets rather than humans, and medicating problems rather than addressing their sources, remain embedded in entertainment industry practice and American culture more broadly. The legacy of the barbiturate era is visible in every contemporary celebrity overdose, every prescription drug addiction epidemic, and every time physicians prescribe chemical solutions to social problems. The specific molecules change, but the fundamental approach, using drugs to make unsustainable situations tolerable rather than changing the situations, persists across generations. Hollywood's golden age sparkled beautifully for audiences while destroying the people who created that sparkle, and the industry learned primarily how to hide the destruction more effectively rather than how to prevent it. The pills keep flowing because the profits keep flowing, and until that calculation changes, the bodies will keep accumulating beneath foundations that are always golden and never solid.